I never expected that a plumbing disaster would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. Before that night, my world was a carefully curated collection of quiet routines and predictable days. My name is Lucas. I'm a book cover designer, which is a convenient way of saying I spend most of my time alone in my apartment, translating other people's stories into images. My life was ordered, it was safe, and if I was being truly honest with myself, it was profoundly lonely. My apartment was my sanctuary, a second-floor unit in a pre-war building with floors that groaned with history and walls thick enough to muffle the sounds of the city into a distant, comforting hum. I knew my neighbors mostly as a collection of sensory data. The scent of garlic and onions from Mrs. Garcia's apartment downstairs every evening around 6. The faint, rhythmic thumping of a bass guitar from the top floor on weekends. And then there was Julian. Julian lived directly across the hall. He was less of a sound and more of a presence. I knew the solid, confident tread of his work boots in the hallway. I heard the deep, easy rumble of his laugh through his door when he had friends over to watch a game. We existed in that strange, intimate orbit of apartment dwellers, sharing 100 tiny, unacknowledged moments. We'd nod at the mailboxes, hold the heavy front door for one another, and exchange pleasantries about the weather that were as meaningless as they were necessary. From these fragments, I had constructed a whole person in my mind. Julian was a carpenter, I guess from the occasional flecks of sawdust in his dark hair and the rugged, capable look of his hands. He was handsome in a way that felt both classic and completely modern, with a strong jaw and eyes that seemed to be permanently crinkling at the corners, as if he were always on the verge of a smile. He exuded a kind of uncomplicated, masculine confidence that I found both intimidating and deeply fascinating. He was, in my estimation, completely and utterly straight. I'd seen him once or twice with a woman, laughing as they headed out for the evening. In my mind, he belonged to a different world, a world of weekend barbecues, pickup basketball games, and easy, uncomplicated relationships. He was the sun-drenched landscape on a postcard from a place I'd never visit. So, I kept my distance, content to observe from the quiet shadow of my own doorway, cataloging his smiles like a secret hobby. My routine was my armor. Wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk for 8 hours, make dinner for 1, read a book, and go to sleep. It was a loop, a safe and predictable pattern that kept the sharp edges of loneliness at bay. I had convinced myself that this was contentment, that the quiet hum of my refrigerator was a worthy substitute for conversation, and the predictable arc of a novel was better than the messy, uncertain path of a real connection. I had my work, my books, my peace. It was enough. Or so I told myself, over and over, until I almost believed it. Life has a funny way of taking the world you've so carefully constructed and shaking it like a snow globe. That's what happened on a Tuesday night in October. It was raining outside, a steady, relentless downpour that drummed against my window panes. I had just finished dinner and was settling onto the couch with a new manuscript when a frantic, hammering knock rattled my door. It was too loud, too urgent to be a delivery. I opened it to find Julian, but it wasn't the calm, smiling Julian from the hallway. His hair was damp and disheveled, his eyes were wide with panic, and his shirt was soaked through. Water dripped from the hem of his jeans, forming a small, dark puddle on my welcome mat. For a second, my brain couldn't process the image. It was like seeing a statue suddenly spring to life and sprint away. "Lucas, man, I am so sorry to bother you," he said, his voice tight with stress. He ran a hand through his wet hair, looking past me toward his own apartment, where I could now hear the distinct and alarming sound of rushing water. "There's a pipe burst in my kitchen, behind the wall. It's everywhere." That was the inciting incident. A burst pipe, a mundane, domestic catastrophe. I didn't know it then, but that torrent of water was about to wash away the foundations of my quiet, orderly life, leaving something new and terrifying and beautiful in its place. My meticulously built dam of routine was about to break, and Julian was standing right at the center of the flood. I stared at him, my mind trying to catch up to the situation. Behind him, the gap in his doorway revealed a sliver of chaos. I could see the glint of water covering his hardwood floors, a distorted reflection of his ceiling light shimmering on the surface. The sound was much louder now, a miniature waterfall roaring where his refrigerator should be. "Oh my God," I said, the words feeling inadequate. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" My mind immediately went into a practical, problem-solving mode. It was easier than dealing with the sheer proximity of a panicked and very attractive neighbor standing on my doorstep. "I called the emergency line," he explained, his breathing a little ragged. "They're sending someone, but they told me to shut off the main water valve for the unit. The super is out of town, of course." He gestured vaguely down the hall. "They're probably going to have to shut off the power to my place too. It's a mess." He looked utterly defeated, the usual confidence stripped away, leaving behind a raw vulnerability that was surprisingly disarming. We spent the next hour in a flurry of chaotic activity. I helped him find the water shutoff in the basement, our flashlight beams cutting through the dusty darkness. We laid down every towel I owned to try and stop the water from seeping under his door and into the hallway. By the time the emergency maintenance guy arrived, a gruff man who seemed entirely unsurprised by the whole situation, the immediate crisis was over. The roaring had subsided to a sad, steady drip. Julian stood in his doorway, surveying the damage. His furniture was soaked, his rugs were ruined, and a large, dark bubble had formed in the drywall of his kitchen. The maintenance guy delivered the verdict with a grim finality. The place was uninhabitable. They'd have to tear out the wall, replace the plumbing, dry everything out, and then rebuild. It would take, at minimum, several days, maybe a week. That was when the reality of his situation seemed to finally hit him. He leaned against the doorframe, the energy draining out of him, leaving him looking tired and lost. He had a place to go, he said, a friend's place across town, but he couldn't get a hold of him. His phone, it turned out, had been on the kitchen counter and was now a casualty of the flood. And then he looked at me. His eyes, usually so bright, were clouded with exhaustion and a deep, mortifying awkwardness. He was about to ask for a favor, a big one, and we were practically strangers. I could see the war playing out on his face, the need for help versus the desire not to impose. "Lucas," he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "This is a massive thing to ask. And please, feel free to say no. I can just, I don't know, find a hotel or something. But, would it be okay if I crashed on your couch? Just for tonight? Until I can figure things out in the morning." My heart did a strange little flip-flop in my chest. My quiet, orderly sanctuary was about to be invaded. My routine, my armor, was about to be breached. Every cautious, self-protective instinct I had screamed no. It was too much, too fast, too close. But then I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the genuine distress in his eyes, the sincere apology in his posture. He wasn't the confident, unattainable man from my imagination anymore. He was just a guy whose apartment had flooded, who needed a safe, dry place to land. "Of course," I heard myself say, the words tumbling out before my anxiety could stop them. "Don't be ridiculous. You can stay as long as you need to." A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was almost palpable. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy with gratitude. "Seriously, Lucas. Thank you. I owe you big time." He had no idea. In that moment, by letting him into my home, I felt like I was the one who had just been thrown a lifeline, even if I didn't understand why yet. The first night was a study in polite awkwardness. I gave him a set of dry clothes, an old sweatshirt, and a pair of sweatpants that were a little too short on his taller frame. While he changed in the bathroom, I stripped the cushions off my couch and wrestled a fitted sheet onto them, piling them with the fluffiest pillows and the warmest blanket I owned. My apartment suddenly felt impossibly small, every movement I made seeming loud and clumsy. When he emerged, he looked exhausted but cleaner, and my gray sweatshirt had never looked so good. "This is really nice of you," he said, gesturing around my living room, which now contained several soggy cardboard boxes filled with the few possessions he'd managed to salvage. "I'm making a huge mess." "It's not a mess, it's just stuff," I replied, trying for a casual tone. "And it's the least I can do." We stood there for a moment in a silence that felt thick and heavy, the only sound the hum of my refrigerator and the distant patter of rain against the glass. The air was charged with the strangeness of the situation, two near strangers suddenly thrust into a forced intimacy. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. It was a rich, dark scent that didn't come from my usual brand. I walked into the kitchen to find Julian, already dressed, standing by the counter, pouring steaming coffee into 2 mugs. He'd found a small, unopened bag of gourmet beans I'd received as a gift and forgotten about in the back of a cupboard. "Morning," he said, offering me a small, tired smile. Figured it was the least I could do. "I hope you don't mind I rooted through your cabinets." The gesture was so simple, so unexpectedly thoughtful, that it threw me off balance. I was used to my solitary mornings, the quiet ritual of making coffee for one. Sharing it felt foreign, but not unwelcome. We drank our coffee in a comfortable silence, the initial awkwardness having dissipated with the light of day. Julian spent most of the morning on my phone, dealing with insurance agents and contractors. I retreated to my home office, trying to focus on designing a cover for a historical romance novel, but my mind kept drifting. I was acutely aware of his presence in the next room, the low murmur of his voice as he navigated the bureaucratic nightmare of his situation. That evening, he insisted on ordering dinner. We ate Thai food straight from the containers, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, because my small dining table was now the designated drying area for a stack of his damp books. And we talked. For the first time, we actually talked. He told me about his work. He was a custom furniture maker, not a general contractor as I'd assumed. He worked with reclaimed wood, turning old forgotten beams and floorboards into beautiful, one-of-a-kind pieces. He spoke about wood with a passion and reverence that was captivating. He described the grain of 100-year-old oak and the scent of freshly cut cedar, and his hands, which I'd only seen as rugged and capable, became the hands of an artist as he described the process of his craft. I told him about my job, about the challenge of capturing the entire soul of a book in a single image. I expected him to be uninterested, but he asked thoughtful questions. He wanted to know how I chose the typography, how I decided on a color palette. He listened with a genuine curiosity that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, truly seen. It was during that conversation that I discovered his secret. He was talking about a piece he was proud of, a large dining table he'd built for a client. "The grain was just incredible," he said, his eyes lighting up. "It had this pattern. I spent an hour just sketching it before I made the first cut." "You sketch?" I asked, my own curiosity piqued. A faint blush crept up his neck. Yeah, a little bit. Just, for planning things out." He seemed almost embarrassed, as if he'd revealed too much. One of the soggy boxes was next to him, and he hesitantly reached inside, pulling out a large, leather-bound book that had miraculously survived the worst of the water damage, though its edges were warped and stained. He opened it carefully and turned it toward me. It was a sketchbook, but it wasn't filled with designs for furniture. It was filled with breathtakingly detailed charcoal drawings. There were architectural sketches of old buildings in the city, intricate studies of tree bark and leaves, and portraits of strangers on the subway, captured in fleeting, candid moments. His talent was immense and raw. This confident, outgoing man had a quiet, observant, artistic soul. It was a side of him I never would have imagined, and it felt like being let in on a profound secret. My carefully constructed image of him crumbled, replaced by someone far more complex and interesting. "These are amazing, Julian," I said, my voice filled with genuine awe. He shrugged, but he couldn't hide the pleased smile that touched his lips. "Thanks. It's just something I do." Later that night, as we were clearing away the empty takeout containers, a small, almost imperceptible thing happened. We both reached for the last plastic box at the same time. The backs of our hands brushed against each other. It was the briefest of contacts, lasting no more than a second, but a jolt of electricity shot up my arm. It was a spark in the dark, sudden and startling. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. Julian froze for a fraction of a second, his eyes meeting mine. I saw a flicker of something in their depths, surprise, confusion, something else I couldn't name. Then he quickly grabbed the container and stood up, turning away to throw it in the trash. The easy flow of our conversation was gone, replaced by a sudden, humming tension. The air in the small room grew thick with unspoken words, and I realized with a terrifying clarity that the ground beneath my feet had just irrevocably shifted. The quiet observer was now part of the scene, and I had no idea what my next line was. The next 2 days passed in a strange new rhythm. The initial awkwardness had returned, but it was different now. It was heavier, charged with the memory of that brief touch and the hours of conversation that had preceded it. We moved around each other with a new, careful choreography. We were still friendly, still sharing coffee in the mornings and making small talk, but there was an undercurrent of awareness that hadn't been there before. I was constantly, painfully aware of him. The way he leaned against the kitchen counter, the sound of his breathing in the quiet of the apartment at night, the scent of his soap that lingered in the bathroom after his shower. My orderly world had been completely upended, but I found that I didn't mind the chaos as much as I thought I would. His presence filled the silence that I had mistaken for peace. The low rumble of his voice on the phone with contractors was a comforting sound. Even his damp boxes stacked in my living room felt less like an intrusion and more like a sign of life. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling, had begun to take root in the back of my mind. It was a tiny, fragile seedling, but it was there, and I was terrified of crushing it. On the fourth night, Julian announced that the contractors were almost done. They had replaced the drywall and were just finishing the painting. He would probably be able to move back into his apartment in another day or two. The news landed in my stomach like a stone. I should have been relieved. My apartment would be my own again. My routine would be restored. But all I felt was a profound, aching sense of disappointment. The thought of returning to my quiet, solitary evenings was suddenly unbearable. "To say thank you for everything," he said, pulling a bag of groceries onto the counter. "I'm making dinner tonight. A real dinner. No takeout." He smiled, and for the first time in a couple of days, it fully reached his eyes, erasing some of the tension that had settled between us. "It's the least I can do for my very gracious landlord." The kitchen filled with the warm, rich smells of garlic sizzling and olive oil and basil being chopped. He moved around the small space with an easy, unthinking grace, and I found myself leaning against the doorframe, just watching him. He put on some music, a mellow indie station, and the apartment was filled with a soft, acoustic melody. It felt domestic. It felt frighteningly real. He handed me a glass of wine and put me in charge of stirring the sauce. We worked side by side, our shoulders occasionally brushing as one of us reached for a spice or a utensil. Each touch was a small, electric shock that I tried to pretend I didn't feel. The conversation was light and easy again, the awkwardness seemingly forgotten, cooked away by the warmth of the stove and the shared task. We ate at the now-cleared dining table. The food was incredible. A simple pasta dish, but he had made the sauce from scratch, and it was rich and flavorful. We talked and laughed, and the bottle of wine emptied. For a few hours, everything felt perfect. It felt like this was our life, our routine. A dangerous fantasy, I knew, but I allowed myself to sink into it, just for a little while. After dinner, I insisted on doing the dishes. It was a familiar, meditative task, a way to ground myself after the dizzying pleasure of the evening. I stood at the sink, my hands in the warm, soapy water, the quiet hum of the music still playing in the background. I was scrubbing the last pan, lost in a haze of wine and wistful thinking, replaying the evening in my head. I didn't hear him come up behind me. One moment I was alone, and the next, I felt the solid warmth of his body close to my back. My breath hitched in my throat. He reached around me, his arm brushing against mine, his chest a hair's breadth from my shoulder blades. He took the last clean glass from the drying rack. "Let me get that," he said. His voice was a low murmur, impossibly close to my ear. My entire body went rigid. I could feel the heat radiating from him. I could smell the faint scent of wine on his breath, mingled with the clean, simple scent of his skin. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. He set the glass down on the counter with a soft clink. And then he didn't move away. His hands came to rest on the counter on either side of my hips, caging me in. It wasn't aggressive, it was a statement. A quiet, deliberate claiming of the space. I stopped breathing altogether. The world seemed to narrow to this one small spot in my kitchen, to the feeling of his presence surrounding me. Slowly, I turned my head to look at him. My movements felt sluggish, as if I were moving through water. Our faces were only inches apart. His eyes, dark and serious in the dim kitchen light, were searching mine. They were filled with a question, a raw, vulnerable uncertainty that mirrored my own. The air between us was electric, humming with everything that had gone unsaid for days. His gaze dropped to my lips, and then lifted back to my eyes, as if asking for permission. I think I nodded. I'm not sure. All I knew was that I wanted this, more than I had wanted anything in a very long time. He leaned in, closing the small distance between us. And then he kissed me. It was impossibly soft, a gentle, tentative pressure of his lips against mine. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. It was a discovery. It tasted of wine and fear and a hesitant, trembling hope. It lasted for only a handful of seconds, but in that brief eternity, the entire axis of my world tilted. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. He pulled back, his eyes wide, a look of profound shock spreading across his face, as if he were as surprised by his own actions as I was. He stared at me for a moment, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The beautiful, fragile spell was broken, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. The immediate aftermath was a blur of frantic, clumsy motion. Julian stumbled back from the counter as if it were red hot, putting a chasm of physical and emotional distance between us. He ran a hand through his hair, his knuckles white. He wouldn't look at me. He stared at the floor, at the ceiling, at a meaningless spot on the wall behind me, anywhere but at my face. I'm sorry, he stammered, the words rushing out in a choked whisper. I shouldn't have done that. I'm so sorry, Lucas. I don't know what I was thinking. His voice was laced with a panic that was so genuine. It felt like a physical blow. Before I could even begin to form a response, before I could find my own voice in the roaring confusion in my head, he turned and practically fled from the kitchen. I heard his footsteps retreat to the living room, and then the soft creak of the couch as he sat down heavily. I remained frozen at the sink, my hands still submerged in the now cooling dishwater. My lips tingled where his had been. My heart was a wild, painful hammering in my chest. The warmth of his body, which had surrounded me only moments before, was gone, replaced by a sudden, chilling cold. His apology echoed in the silent room. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. What did it mean? That was the only question my brain could produce, and it ran on a torturous loop. Was he sorry he had kissed me specifically? Or sorry that he had kissed a man? Was it an apology born of regret for the act itself, or of fear of my reaction? Hope and dread waged a violent war inside me. One moment, I clung to the memory of the kiss itself, the softness, the hesitation that felt like genuine feeling. The next, his panicked retreat and his stark apology crushed that hope into dust. I finally forced my legs to move. I dried my hands on a towel, my movements stiff and robotic. I turned off the kitchen light and walked into the living room. The only light came from a single dim lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the room. Julian was sitting on the edge of the couch, hunched over with his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. He didn't look up when I entered. The air between us was thick enough to suffocate. The easy camaraderie we had built over the last few days had evaporated, shattered into a million pieces. We were back to being strangers, but it was worse now, because we were strangers who had shared something intimate and were now pretending it hadn't happened. I wanted to say something, to ask him what was going on, to tell him that I wasn't sorry, that it was okay. But the words were stuck in my throat, choked by a paralyzing fear of rejection. What if I spoke and he only apologized again? I couldn't bear that. So I said nothing. I mumbled a quiet, good night, and retreated to my bedroom, closing the door behind me. The soft click of the latch felt like a final, definitive sound, like a cell door locking. Sleep was impossible. I lay in the dark, staring at my ceiling, replaying the entire night, the entire week, in my head. I analyzed every conversation, every glance, every moment of shared laughter. I had allowed myself to hope. I had let him into my quiet, orderly world, and he had filled it with noise and light and feeling. And now, it seemed, he regretted ever stepping inside. I saw myself through his eyes, the quiet, lonely neighbor who had offered him a place to stay. Had he just been swept up in a moment of gratitude and stress? Was I just a convenient port in a storm, a mistake made under the influence of wine and exhaustion? The self-doubt was a corrosive acid, eating away at the fragile confidence I had started to feel. The image I had of him, the complex, artistic, kind man, began to warp. Maybe my initial assessment was right after all. Maybe he did belong to another world, and for a few days, our orbits had accidentally crossed, but now things were being set right. He would go back to his life, and I would go back to mine. The thought left a hollow ache in the center of my chest. The next day was agonizing. The silence in the apartment was a living entity. We moved around each other like ghosts, our paths carefully calculated to avoid intersection. We didn't make eye contact. We communicated in monosyllables. When his phone rang, he took the call out in the hallway. The proximity that had once felt like a burgeoning intimacy was now a form of exquisite torture. I was trapped in a small space with my own hope and my own heartbreak, and I couldn't escape either of them. Late in the afternoon, he got the call. His apartment was ready. The paint was dry, the water was back on. He could move back in. He delivered the news to me from the living room while I was in the kitchen, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They're done," he said. "I can, start moving my stuff back. I'll be out of your way by tonight." Out of my way. The phrase was like a slap in the face. It was a formal, polite dismissal. It drew a clear line between us. You are here, I am here, and I am a burden to you. It was the complete opposite of how I felt, but I didn't know how to tell him that. So I just nodded and said, "Okay." The finality of it was crushing. This was it. The end of the strangest, most wonderful, and most painful week of my life. The silence stretched into the early evening, thick and unbearable. The end of our strange cohabitation was looming, and with it, the end of any chance to understand what had happened between us. I was pretending to read a book on the couch, the same paragraph blurring before my eyes for the 10th time. My bags were packed with regret and unspoken feelings. I had resigned myself to never knowing, to letting him walk back across the hall and out of my life forever, leaving me with nothing but a ghost of a kiss. Then, Julian broke the silence. He had been sitting in the armchair across from me, staring at his hands for the better part of an hour. He cleared his throat, and the small sound made me jump. "Lucas," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Can we talk?" My head snapped up. He was looking at me directly for the first time all day. His expression was serious, his brow furrowed with a mixture of anxiety and determination. My heart, which had been beating a slow, funereal rhythm, suddenly kicked into a frantic gallop. This was it. The conversation I had been both dreading and praying for. "Yeah," I managed to say, my own voice sounding thin and reedy to my ears. "Okay." He took a deep breath, like a man about to dive into deep, cold water. He didn't move from his chair, but his intensity seemed to bridge the distance between us. "First," he began, "what I said last night. That I was sorry. I was. But I wasn't sorry for the reason you think." He paused, searching for the right words, his gaze unwavering. "I wasn't sorry that I kissed you. I was sorry that I did it like that. That I panicked and ran away and made you feel. However I made you feel. Awful, I imagine. For that, I am truly sorry." I just stared at him, unable to process his words. He wasn't sorry he kissed me. The thought was a spark of light in the darkness of my anxiety. "I've been confused," he continued, the words coming more easily now. "This whole week. This whole situation." He gestured around my living room, at his boxes, at the temporary life we had built. "This wasn't planned. The flood, I mean. But my interest in you. That's not new." My breath caught in my throat. "I've noticed you for months, Lucas," he confessed, a faint flush rising on his neck. "Across the hall. I'd see you coming and going, always with a book, always looking like you were a million miles away in some interesting world inside your head. I wanted to talk to you, to actually talk to you, more times than I can count. But I'd just freeze up. I'd manage a stupid comment about the weather and then kick myself for the rest of the day." He let out a short, self-deprecating laugh. I didn't know how. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression earnest and open. "And then this whole thing happened, and suddenly I was here, in your space, and I got to see you. The real you. And you were even kinder and smarter and funnier than I had imagined. And I was terrified." "Terrified of what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Of this," he said, gesturing between the two of us. "Of how much I liked being here with you. I've never been with a guy before, Lucas. I've never even really let myself think about it. But with you it just felt right. It felt easy. And that scared the hell out of me. The kiss. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't the wine. It was me, finally doing the one thing I'd wanted to do all week. And then I panicked. I said I was sorry because I was afraid of what it all meant. A wave of understanding, of profound, heart-stopping relief, washed over me. All the anxiety, all the self-doubt from the past 24 hours, it all just melted away, leaving behind a raw, tender hope. He had been just as scared and confused as I was. It was my turn to speak. The fear was gone, replaced by a desperate need to make him understand. "Julian," I said, and my voice was stronger now. "I watched you too. From across the hall. I thought you were, I don't know, part of a different world. Completely out of my league. When you asked to stay here, I was terrified too. But not because I didn't want you here." I took a shaky breath. I was terrified because of how much I did. The relief on his face was a mirror of my own. It was a beautiful, breathtaking sight. The tension that had held him so rigidly seemed to release all at once. He stood up from his chair and crossed the small space between us in 2 strides. He didn't sit next to me on the couch, but knelt on the floor in front of me, so our eyes were level. "So," he said, his voice soft, a small, hopeful smile playing on his lips. "Can I try that again? The kiss." Without the panicked, idiotic apology this time. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, a lump forming in my throat. He reached up and gently cupped my face with his hands. His palms were warm and slightly rough, the hands of a man who builds things. He leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. I leaned forward to meet him. This time, the kiss was different. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was sure and deep and confident. It was a statement, not a question. It was filled with all the unspoken words of the past week, with all the fear and hope and longing. It was the feeling of a world snapping perfectly into place. It was the feeling of coming home. In the weeks that followed, my apartment felt both empty and full. Empty, because Julian was no longer sleeping on my couch. His boxes were gone. His towel was no longer hanging in my bathroom. But it was full of the memory of him, and full of the promise of him. We didn't need a flood to bring us together anymore. Now, we crossed the hall by choice. Our first real date was a trip to a salvage yard, where he spent hours sifting through piles of old wood, telling me the history of each piece. I had never been happier to be covered in a fine layer of dust. Our second date was at a quiet little restaurant he knew, and we talked for hours, uninterrupted by insurance adjusters or contractors. We were slowly, carefully, building something new, something solid. A few months later, I was standing in his apartment. It was completely restored, looking even better than it had before. The smell of fresh paint had been replaced by the scent of sawdust and lemon oil from the furniture he'd been polishing. We were cooking dinner together, a comfortable, easy routine we had fallen into. I was chopping vegetables at the counter while he stirred a sauce on the stove. It was a scene of such simple, perfect domesticity that it made my heart ache with gratitude. He came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder, watching my hands. It was an echo of that night in my kitchen, but this time there was no tension, no uncertainty. There was only warmth and a deep, comforting sense of rightness. He pointed with his chin toward a faint, almost invisible water stain on the ceiling near the corner, a tiny imperfection the painters had missed. "You know," he said, his voice a low rumble against my back, "I think I'm actually glad that pipe burst." I stopped chopping and leaned back into his embrace, turning my head to kiss his cheek. "Me too," I said. "It was the best catastrophe I've ever lived through." He turned me around in his arms to face him, his expression soft and serious. "Thank you, Lucas," he said, "for opening your door that night." "Thank you," I replied, "for knocking. I never expected that a plumbing disaster would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It took a flood to break down the walls I had so carefully built around myself. My quiet, orderly world was washed away, and in the middle of all that chaos, I found him. Or maybe, we found each other. Sometimes the biggest messes bring the most beautiful clarity. Sometimes you have to let everything fall apart, so something new, something stronger, and something far more beautiful can be built in its place.